Hello, and thank you for joining us. This is Juanita Schwartzkopf with Focus Management Group, and I'm joined today by my associate, Joe Karel. We're going to be discussing the convergence of the emerging trends that we're seeing relative to labor shortages and other labor-related issues, inflationary pressures, commodity price changes, supply chain stress, and cybersecurity. These headwinds are challenging when they happen separately, and they're even more challenging today when they are converging.
It's a pleasure to be able to talk with you today, Juanita. These are important discussions for lenders and companies to have now. No business is immune from some combination of the impact of these emerging trends. These trends are individually and collectively more impactful than most people and businesses have experienced for 20 or more years.
That's for sure. And that is why it is time for businesses, every business, to fully embrace risk management with an eye to developing alternative plans and strategies to maximize the potential for future success. In this podcast, we want to discuss the need for each business to embrace the concept of a champion for change.
You and I have been talking about this champion for change for several weeks now. Could you describe what you mean by this term?
That's a good question. You can call this person anything. You can call them a change agent, a disruptor, a risk manager. But the real key is there needs to be somebody at the company, irrespective of the name or the title, who's going to be a champion, who'll drive the company to evaluate financial and operational impacts of these trends: labor, supply chain, inflation, commodity prices, cybersecurity. The person is going to need to work with all members of senior management to develop alternative strategies through a detailed analysis. And then the team is going to have to make plans to address the conclusions reached to, again, maximize the possibility of the business being successful. The champion is going to need to use best practices to drive their company to capture the information needed to make the best decisions for future success.
Wonderful. You use the term best practices. What do you mean by that?
To me, best practices means analysis, systems, and processes that help a company throughout their sales, finance, and operations to maximize performance. It can be something simple, like having an accounts receivable collection process and credit policies, or it can be more complex. For example, sensitivity analysis for labor changes or key input cost changes.
So best practices means all the things companies do to manage their performance, but basing decisions on factual analysis and monitoring performance in real time to adjust and adapt.
Absolutely. It's all about factual analysis, cutting through the nonsense. I say eyeballs and common sense, but based on a factual analysis that lets you monitor performance in real time.
Go into some details on working capital management, if we could. It seems like the emerging trends we are seeing are all pressuring a company's cash flow and their working capital management at the present time.
Yeah, for sure. Working capital management is an area where I am seeing stress in every company that I'm looking at right now. So for working capital best practices, let's start the process of analysis with managing customer relationships. A business needs to know profitability by customer, profitability by product, profitability by division, or profitability by location. There has to be a measure within the company's analysis that tells everybody which customers or products or divisions are performing better than others. And along with that, the business needs to clearly understand the contracts that it has with customers. You want to pull out your contracts and develop some type of tracking mechanism so that you can see the ability to increase prices. Any auto renewal of contracts, many contracts come with, automatic renewal if you don't notify 30 days prior to an anniversary date. You need to track renewal dates, and you need to understand what each contract allows in terms of escalation and the escalation terminology. And I want to just back up for a second to the bid process, because managing these customer relationships and using these best practices really has to begin with the bid process. Are the key input pricings updated frequently? What is the bid lock period? If a company provides a bid to a potential client, is that price locked for some period of time? What's the escalation wording during the bid period? For example, is there wording that allows you to increase the bid if steel price changes, or if some other commodity increases? And you also want to think about the time period between the acceptance of the bid and the project start date. Sometimes that happens very quickly, but sometimes there's a long period of time between bid acceptance and potential project start. So what's that escalation wording during that period? And then what's the proposed escalation wording for the contract itself? We need to step back and we need to think about the entire process from developing a bid through collection and dealing with the customers.
Great, that makes a lot of sense. This can sound daunting, but a business needs to start somewhere, right, with this approach. For example, maybe profitability by customer hasn't been developed in great detail, but the analysis needs to begin with the information available and then work to improve the accuracy. Perhaps a business can look big picture at gross profit before labor costs to identify impacts of inflation or commodity price changes, and then expand to gross profit after the allocated labor.
Absolutely, Joe. You have to start somewhere. And when we're getting involved with businesses, that's exactly what we do. We start with the data that we have available to us, and then we can always get smarter and get better, but we have to start with what we have. Now let's talk about best practices for managing supplier relationships. When you look at contracts with suppliers, you have to consider these questions. Is there an ability to lock in prices? Should we be evaluating hedging capabilities? Are there auto renewals of contracts with suppliers? What are the renewal dates? And again, what is that escalation terminology? Because we're seeing so many of these trends, these emerging trends coming together at this point in time, it's really important to make sure you identify both your contracts with your suppliers and your contracts with your customers, and make sure that the wording, the terminology makes sense for today. It probably made a lot of sense a year or two ago, but let's make sure it makes sense today.
And when a company relies on commodities, it is important to identify the specific trackable commodity products being used and identify what % of costs are in commodity products.
Absolutely. Operating cycle management is really key now. You're managing accounts receivable, you're managing inventory, and you're managing accounts payable levels. And that is complicated by changing prices and supply chain issues. So companies that have existing ABL lines of credit that were workable prior to all of these trends converging are experiencing some real structure concerns right now. Some of the things that we're seeing are the sizing of the line of credit to your point, Joe, on commodity prices, if the price of steel goes up 400% or the price of corn doubles, those things impact every part of working capital, accounts receivable, inventory, and accounts payable, and the size of the line of credit may no longer be sufficient. Also, what we're seeing on the asset relationship limits, that would be a tie between accounts receivable and inventory, and not to exceed kind of category, or even between finished goods, raw materials, and work in process. Those relationships may have changed, and it's going to be important that you anticipate what's happening both from the supply chain side and the commodity price and inflation side when you're thinking about your asset relationship limits in your ABL structure. Another thing that we're seeing companies have problems with is ineligibles on their ABL structure. So for example, it may have been workable for stale inventory to be set at any inventory amount that is greater than 6 months on hand. But with the supply chain concerns, some businesses have had to extend the amount, increase the amount of inventory that they have on hand. So maybe with these supply chain concerns, that stale inventory should be triggered at 9 months rather than 6 months.
What types of analysis techniques do businesses need to dust off and start using now?
Well, two things that I think are key to dust off: price volume variance analysis, and the second is sensitivity analysis.
For price volume variance, I assume that is both for sales and for key inputs.
Definitely. It can be simple. It can be the number of gallons of fuel sold and the price per gallon compared to the number of gallons purchased and price per gallon. It's important that the business start the analysis somewhere and then expand as questions are developed. You fine tune. Maybe you start out with number of gallons and then you go to number of gallons by product, and then you go even further into that analysis. But you need to start somewhere with price volume variance.
Can you tell us a little bit about what you mean by sensitivity analysis?
Sure. That is, to me, that's how does a $1 per unit change in key inputs affect financial performance? For example, a $1 per bushel change in the price of corn. How does that impact financial performance? A $1 change in lumber prices, a $1 change in flour prices. Or how does a 1% change in all non-labor costs impact performance? That's trying to get at the inflation impacts. Each business is going to need to start to review the CPI and the PPI categories. That's the consumer price index and the producer price index categories, to see where there are areas in their performance that are more significantly impacted by changes in CPI and PPI. What I'd recommend that businesses do is go to the Bureau of Industry Statistics and look at the CPI and look at the PPI in total, and then look at the individual categories that make up that total.
I think it's important to look at expense structures. For example, light item cost changes resulting from escalation clauses in contracts, such as lease or rental agreements. Are those clauses tied to CPI or PPI, and when do they reset?
Yeah, that's also a very good question. I think that when you are looking at an income statement structure, you may think in terms of, well, my lease amount is fixed or my rental payment is fixed. But if you look at those agreements and there are clauses that are tied to either changes in the CPI or changes in the PPI, you might have those triggered, those increases triggered because of what we're seeing as far as significant increases in inflation and costs. I'm really a firm believer in using something called a matrix performance analysis. This is an analysis that takes a lot of complex inputs and really gets down to what are the number of combinations of events that are going to result in a company achieving break-even performance or adequate fixed charge coverage performance. I think that when you have so many inputs changing, coming at you as a business manager, it's really important to maximize the opportunities that you have for success.
Great. You know, when I'm talking to lenders and business owners, it seems that companies are taking one of two types of approaches. In one approach, the company is in a great level of denial, or as we like to say in the industry, has their head in the sand and reacts to trends as impacts occur. In the second approach, the company is proactive and works to employ best practices, analyze alternative strategies, and manage its risk profile.
That is so true. The businesses that are reacting to changes rather than being proactive, those are the ones that are going to have problems in the future. Risk managers, when you think of the term risk managers, you typically see those people in large company structures, and that needs to change today. Every business needs that change agent, that disruptor, that risk manager who's going to be advocating constantly for a deep analysis of financial and operating performance. And if a business doesn't have the skill set internally, then what I'd recommend is the business determine the trends that are going to have the largest impact on that business and prioritize best practices for those larger impact items first.
Then outside resources such as focus management group can be utilized on a project by project basis to work through specific best practices.
I definitely agree with that. And sometimes companies like to get involved in project management when you're dealing with these kinds of analyses and changing environments. So, for example, on a project by project basis, we might focus on customer profitability or product line profitability for one company. At another company, they might see the most impact on trying to come up with alternatives and deal with labor issues. So we might focus more on that type of an analysis for that company. It doesn't mean that all of the best practices are not important to each company. It just means that when you have limited resources or you're going to use an outside resource, that you try to get the most bang for your buck as quickly as you can. And I think that successful companies, when I think about the end of 2021 and moving into 2022, the successful companies are going to have this champion for change or this disruptor. The name and the title are not important. It's the commitment to completing this analysis quickly and, like you said, being proactive instead of reactive.
Thank you, Juanita. I appreciate your time today. I hope everybody finds this information that we've discussed very useful and helpful in their daily practice.
Thanks, Joe.